So this is always the time where I announce the scripture text for you to turn to, because I'm a Bible preacher, not a speech maker. But every 3 years, I have a speech for you. It's not a it's a history lesson on freedom. So if you'll forgive me once every 3 years for not being a Bible preacher, there's nothing I like better than being a Bible preacher. I am not a speech maker. But about a decade ago, my mother from time to time, she's a wonderful reader. In fact, she told me this week she has read 5 books this week. Loves to read. And so she, every now and again, will drop a stack of books on me. And one of those stacks of books contained a history book called 7 Tipping Points That Save Freedom for the World. And I read that book, and I was in awe at how precious and rare freedom is in the history of our world. And I was amazed that the things that I read in it, I had never heard before. I'm a nerd. I'm a school person. When the teachers taught it to me, I absorbed it. And I thought, how is it that in all the history classes I have taken, in all the civics classes that I have taken, I've not heard these things? Well, maybe I did and I wasn't paying attention. So you all pay attention today. Let me ask you a question. Can you imagine a world without freedom? Can you imagine what the world would look like without freedom? Political freedom, economic freedom, religious freedom. So this is just an obtuse thought exercise unless you ask this question. Can you imagine your life without freedom? Without the right to vote on who would represent you in government? Without representation for the people who would decide on taxation? Without the freedom to attend the church of your choice as God would lead you by your conscience between you and Him? Economic freedom. Can you imagine your life that you would be forced to work, but you didn't get to keep your wages? Someone else would take your wages from you. We call it human trafficking, but in the history of the world, economic slavery has always been a terrible evil in the world. Can you imagine living your whole life as a slave in a quarry cutting rock for a pyramid you would never even see? There were tens of thousands of people as those pyramids were built that lived their entire lives, their very short, very hard lives, in a rock quarry, cutting stones for a monument that they would never see. Can you imagine living in China about the time that Christ walked the earth? When the emperor died, dozens or even hundreds of peasants would be sacrificed and buried with the king as an honor to the king. Now that all sounds like something which just seems a little weird, but can you imagine being the parent of a hopeful, healthy young man or woman who was chosen to be a sacrifice to be killed just because the dictator died? There would be hundreds of sacrifices made, hundreds of bodies which would be placed in there to show how significant they were. But can you imagine it being your child that would be plucked from your home and sacrificed just without your choice, you didn't have any option in the matter? Can't you imagine that there were many fathers who chased down after their kidnapped children who would be sacrificed? Can you imagine the communist Soviet Union of our lifetimes, where you whisper a little anti-government joke at work, and before the end of your shift, they would come and take you away without arrest warrants, without notifying your family, and put you in a work camp to work you to death? Hard to imagine that world, isn't it, from where we stand right now? But that is the reality that many, in fact, majority, have faced in the history of the world. Can you imagine being the 40 million citizens, or maybe we should call them peasants, who were murdered by their own government as godless communism rose up in China? In the last century, we're not talking about thousands of years ago. In the great People's Revolution, they murdered dozens and dozens and dozens of millions of people who didn't agree with their ideologies. Can you imagine being a nun or or a priest or a practitioner of Christianity in that environment where you would not deny Christ, and they would line you up and just kill whole towns, murder whole towns in your grandparents' lifetimes. Can you imagine being a father who all of a sudden realizes his daughter doesn't make it home from school? And as he begins to inquire of why, he finds out from the neighbors that the dictator's son picked her up on the way home and she's disappeared and nobody knows where she is. And there's no recourse and there's no help and there's no hope. If you think that these are from a land far away and a long ago time, this is the way that people live when there is not freedom and accountability in the world. In the modern military dictatorships of Africa and the Middle East, from the ancient times to the present world, from ancient civilizations to modern times, across every continent and culture, from generations and kingdoms lost in the fog of history to the well-documented atrocities of the modern day, stories just like these represent the common lives of how our human family has lived in the world. And as foreign and as crazy as these stories might sound to you, these stories could be recounted and even one-upped by billions of people throughout the world's history. These examples that I have made for you are not unique. They are not the exception that proves the rule. They are common examples of the hopelessness and powerlessness that the vast majority of all people who have ever been born into our world have experienced. They have nowhere to turn for justice. The government is the source of oppression rather than the source of protection. No voice raised to protect the young, the weak, the women, those who cannot protect themselves. The only thing that matters in that world is control and power and strength and having the weapons to dominate those around you. For those of us fortunate to live in the United States of America, it is easy for us to take for granted the unparalleled liberty that we have experienced in the last 200 plus years. And unless you are a serious student of world history or have traveled extensively, you may actually not recognize how unique and rare and precious the blessings of liberty really are. There are very few examples of freedom in all the world's history, and they have been fleeting. So the best estimates of how many people have ever lived on planet Earth range from about 100 billion to about 110 billion. If you take the current population of the Earth and go back through the time when Earth's population has been counted, and you track that all the way back down to Adam and Eve, then you can estimate that in the history of the world, every soul that has ever been born on planet Earth, about 110 billion. So that's kind of a unique figure to have in your mind. Every soul that has ever been born that will ever face judgment before God, about 110 billion. Freedom House estimates that currently on the planet we currently live in, about 3 billion people live in free nations. Only 3 billion. That is less than half of the total of the souls which currently live on planet Earth. It has been estimated that about 554 million people have lived in freedom in the United States since 1780. We can guess that about another billion have lived in the free nations of Europe as they have emerged and disappeared in spurts. And even if you're generous in the estimates of the governments that we see around us now and have been in our lifetimes, and then go back through the free nations in the history of the world, it is a generous estimate to say that 4 to 5% of everyone who has ever lived on planet Earth has lived in freedom. A generous estimate. Of the 110 billion souls who have ever lived on planet Earth, it is pretty easy to say that 5% would be a very generous figure. It's not very much. It's rare. So if that seems crazy to you, let me lay a little extra truth on you. Yale professor Robert Dahl was studying democracies in the world, and he could only identify 22 nations in the world with a democracy older than 50 years. So many of your lifetimes, I will be 45 this fall. So democracies that have existed in the world, even now when we think of democracy and freedom as a norm, there are only 22 nations that have lived under a democratic form of government, even with partial freedoms, for a single lifetime. Costa Rica was the only Latin American country that had a democracy older than 50, older than me. The only one in the Middle East? Israel. The only one in all of Asia? Japan. All of Asia has one democracy older than my lifetime. All of the Middle East, only Israel. All of Latin America, only Costa Rica. Is that shocking to you to have that revelation? Doesn't it magnify the awesomeness of the freedom which we have lived under? Well, what does it mean to be free? I have said free countries, and the cynics among us must say, well, what do you really mean by free? Well, I think let's go back to the Founding Fathers' description of what they thought it meant to be free. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's what the framers of our Constitution felt was the basis, the beginnings of freedom. So here are 5 characteristics of what I would define as freedom and democracy. Number 1, self-governance. The people have the right to choose those who will make and enforce the laws, and the right to refuse to be governed by those who are not chosen. That we vote. That we vote is a powerful thing in the world. I have seen in new democracies, fledgling democracies in the Middle East, when they would go and they would make you dip your finger in an ink blot so that you would not be able to vote again. But when people would see that you had voted, many people would come under terrible persecution as they tried to suppress votes. They would beat people who had voted. They would try to coerce them into controlling them. Self-governance is an amazing freedom. And for those of us who can vote, it's a deep offense to me when we don't vote. When we are too lazy to vote, it is an abdication of a right that was sacrificed for. When we are too lazy to vote, we spit on the graves of every one of those soldiers who died for our rights. Vote. Whatever you do in response to this sermon, please vote. I'm not going to tell you how to vote. You pray to God and ask Him to reveal to you the people that we should vote for to represent us. But the one thing that as your pastor in the name of God, I ask of you, please vote. Every time you can. Be informed of the issues. Be informed of those people who are on that ballot. Make a specific effort to vote. Because that right is precious, and it's rare, and it's fleeting in the history of the world. Self-governance is one of the great freedoms the history of the world has ever offered. Number 2, the number 2 way we define freedom, fundamental rights. Life, personal liberty, the right to keep your property, the right to defend your property, the fruits of your labor, personal liberties. We would encapsulate in there freedom of speech, freedom to say what you say without fear of reprisal from your government. I traveled all over Africa. I visited 4 different nations in Africa, and I came home. And one of the things that I was very grateful for when I came home was this, that I knew that I could say anything about my government, and I didn't have to worry about being taken to jail for it. Whatever you think of your leaders, you are free to say what you want. Now, does it mean you should say some of those things? Oh, boy. Some of the Facebook posts I see. But you know what I am grateful for? That we can say those things without fear of reprisal from our government. Because many of the places that I visited, if you said something negative about the leader, you could expect a knock on your door. Your children could expect to grow up in a fatherless home. You had to keep all of your opinions to yourself out of fear of death, of incarceration, of forced labor. I've been to many places on this earth where they couldn't say what they felt out of fear of their own government. I want you to know I am proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. I might not know everything, but I believe this: I'm a free man on the earth. My fundamental rights, I have personally experienced these liberties, the right to retain my own personal property, to Practice my religion. Freedom of religion is the reason that our nation was founded. No matter what those college professors are teaching kids today, the pursuit of religious freedom is the reason that they got on those ships. They had been told by their government there's only going to be allowed to be one church. And anybody who disagrees with the central tenets of that church, you're out. And they said, we want more freedom than that. We want to be able to follow God by our own convictions. And they loaded up on ships and risked everything. Risked their lives, risked their families, risked their futures, risked their fortunes, simply so that they could come and worship God freely. Freedom of thought, freedom of the press, freedom to travel. It's a great freedom to be able to travel. These fundamental rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, they are a part of our lives and we take them for granted. Well, friends, I want to ask you not to take them for granted. Enjoy them, use them, treasure them. And in the world where people are oppressed, and the United States of America has sent our military to try to bring freedom to those places, pray for them. Pray for them. We have been a force for freedom in the world. Whatever good and bad America has done, America has been a force for freedom in the world. I would say this, the greatest force for freedom in the history of our globe is the United States of America. Here's my third definition of freedom, that all are created equal, that each one is equal under the law, that God made us all and we are all one family under God. All lives matter. Black lives matter. Blue lives matter. All lives matter. Every soul matters to God, and every soul should matter to us. All men are created equal. This knowledge is a part of freedom, that we would respect each other as brothers and sisters made by God, equal in every way that matters. We might be unequal in our bank accounts. We might be unequal in how good you look or how bad you look. You might be unequal in your height or shortness. You might be unequal in socioeconomic background and educational background. There are many, many ways that we are unequal. But you want to know the one thing that makes us all equal? We all have one soul. Every person ever born onto this planet has a soul, and they have been created in the image of God. And every soul will stand before the judgment seat of Christ one day. That's what the Word teaches us. That, my friends, is true equality. Kings will kneel beside peasants at the judgment seat of Christ and have no other recourse than the choices of their life. All are created equal. Number 4, commitment to justice. You cannot have freedom without justice. Each receives just rewards for their punishment, regardless of race or class or wealth. And the cynics among us, you can sneer at me all you want. Tell me that there is no real justice like that anywhere in the world. The rich always get away with more than the poor get away with. The system is always stacked against them. And God help us, I'd have few arguments to make against you, except this. When our forefathers came, they said they wanted a better way, a more pure way. And I have been to many places that their recourse for lawsuits and appealing to their government, they could only dream of the kind of court systems that America has. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. You want to know the problem with our courts? People. We got to rely on people to be judges, and we got to rely on people to be lawyers, and we got to rely on people to be advocates. And people are imperfect, and so we make imperfect systems. One day there will be a perfect judge. And until that day, we got to do our best, our very best, to live with justice for everyone equal under the law. And fifth and lastly, commitment to the rule of law. That the president and the common citizen are subject to the exact same laws. That's what we believe. That's what the founding fathers put in, that the rule of law would be the governing force in our nation. Not a dictator, not personalities, the rule of law. That each of us would be governed by the exact same rules. So we have to work that out all the time, don't we? All the time there's some who get more advantage and less advantage, and we have to work that out. But we, as the body of believers in Jesus Christ's body, should be at the front lines of advocating for the rule of law. We are all made by God in His image. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ in the human family. We all deserve the same rights and freedoms and privileges. And not only for us in America, although I think we should focus on America because that's where we can make the most impact, but globally, I have heard many begin to say, we in America, why are we involved in the world at all? We should just pull back and let the world go to hell in a handbasket. And I understand why you might feel that way, but to me, friends, I think if not America, then who? Who do you want influencing for freedom in the world, if not America? It's very difficult and it's very messy and it's very expensive. And then the people that you try to help often hate you. So how do you do this? How do you work it out? How do you live this way? Well, when I say free nations, those are the standards that I'm talking about. Freedom of self-governance, freedom of fundamental rights, the knowledge that all are created equal, a commitment to justice, and a commitment to the rule of law. These are the freedoms that I'm talking about. And by those standards that you and I might take for granted, about 5% of everyone who has ever lived and is living on planet Earth has lived with these conditions, even being tried for. So how did this precious fleeting gift of freedom come to us? Well, it took a long time and it had to overcome many hurdles. And to call it a miracle, to call the freedoms that we live under a miracle would not be a stretch. Let me read for you a quote by Dr. Walter Williams. Mankind's history is one of systematic arbitrary abuse and control by the elite. It's a tragic history where hundreds of millions of unfortunate souls have been slaughtered, mostly by their own government. And a historian writing 200 or 300 years from now might view these liberties that existed for a tiny portion of mankind's population, mostly in the Western world, and for only a tiny portion of its history, the last century or two. These historians may view this as a historical curiosity that defies explanation. That historian might also observe that the curiosity was only a temporary phenomenon and mankind reverted back to the traditional state of affairs, arbitrary control and abuse. That's what a historian, a secular historian, wrote. That if life goes on, it's hard for him to imagine that freedom can persist in our world. That's what a precarious thing freedom is. And friends, I agree with what I read, that if our children and grandchildren are to live as free men and women, we must all understand how precious and rare our liberties are, where they came from, and how we preserve it. So let me take you on a quick historical journey that will only take 2,700 years. If you want to know the origins of the ideas that resulted in our precious Constitution, you have to go back 2,700 years to the Old Testament days. The Assyrians were attacking the kingdom of Israel, and the northern 10 countries were lost to history. So when Israel settled, there were 12 tribes, right? And the northern 10 tribes, and then in the end, there were 2 southern tribes that persisted. But the Assyrians were an empire that conquered by decimation. When the Assyrian, most places in the history of the world, the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire, you go back through the empires, what they did was they conquered you, they left you intact, and then they would charge you money. And you would have to send money to your conquerors. But what the Assyrians did was they were culture destroyers. They found out that if you leave people intact, they'll eventually rebel. But if you demolish their culture, there's nobody to rebel. And so they would come in, and if they conquered you, John, they would take your family, and they would take you and send you 100 miles this way, take your wife and send her 100 miles this way, give you a different wife, give you a different husband. You would go 100 miles that way, and you'd go 100 miles that way. You'd never see each other again. You'd be married off into different cultures and different families and have no choice in the matter. That's how the Assyrians did it. And because of that, the northern 10 tribes were totally lost to history. There's no lineage that goes back through there to identify where they went, because the Assyrians were culture destroyers. And when they came to the siege of Jerusalem, and if the Assyrians had conquered Jerusalem, Judaism would have disappeared from the planet. And by extension, Christianity. But in that, and you can read the Old Testament Bible story where the Assyrians show up and the king is told, God is going to deliver us. You just stand firm and watch. And one day when they wake up, the Assyrian army has disappeared. It's a miracle. It was a miracle of preservation. Now, we would think, why wouldn't God stop them earlier, right? Isn't that the great mystery of how these things unfold? But God preserved Judaism when the Assyrians were not allowed to finish their conquering. And Christianity developed from Judaism. You go forward a little bit in time, and the Greeks won against the Persians at Thermopylae. There's a movie called 300. Well, the Greeks were the first place where city-states were practiced, where democracies were sort of fledgling democracies. Each of those Greek city-states would elect for themselves a king. They called him a king, but he was an elected king, and it was a meritocracy. And there were every little place, every little city-state had its own way of functioning. And so in that environment, they experimented with the foundations of what would become democracy. As the Persians were coming through, they would have absolutely overwhelmed the Greeks, but the Greeks won out, held their ground, and Alexander the Great would never have been able to spread Greek culture throughout all the Middle East and all of Europe. And without that Greek thought influence, the Roman Empire would have been very different. Remember the Roman Empire that had a Senate? A Roman Empire had a Senate, and they were elected people. Now, they weren't elected from everybody. They were elected from only property owners, and it was not a perfect deal, which we saw, obviously. And as they were trying with democracy type stuff, you all remember what happened. Octavian and Augustus and all the betrayals and Et tu, Brute and right, all of that mess. And then you go back to a monarch who declares himself to be a god and tries to make the Roman Empire a theocracy. It's tough. It's tough for freedom in the world. But the Greeks, they persisted. And their thoughts were able to spread. About 300 years after the birth of Christ, Constantine converts to Christianity, restores the Roman Empire, and makes Christianity the central religion of the Roman Empire. And without Christianity, Europe and America would have developed very different attitudes about self-governance and the free will and human rights. Christians for 300 years were brutalized until Constantine made them the official religion. Now, I will tell you this, Christianity has always flourished in times of persecution. And whenever Christianity has become the official religion, it has always been watered down. So in one way, this was the beginning of Christianity as politics and power and control. But in another way, how could freedom as we have known it ever form without Constantine choosing Christianity as the religion in 312 AD? Then the armies of Islam came from the Middle East all the way into Europe, and Charles Martel defeated the seemingly unstoppable Islamic army. And for the next 900 years, many battles were fought to keep Europe from falling to Islamic armies. And if Europe had fallen to the Islamic armies, we would all be Islamists instead of Christians. In 1241, the Mongols come. Genghis Khan invents the crossbow, and which can shoot through chainmail and armor, and decimates the armies of Europe. And they're marching freely and come all the way to Austria. The Mongolian army came in their conquering wave all the way to Austria before it appears that Genghis Khan died, and they just went back and never came back again. And Europe was not conquered by the Asian armies. And then the discovery of the New World happens, which leads to wealth and advances in science and navigation and architecture and military tactics and weapons and human resources, all of which saw Europe rise as the global power and allowed Western thought and philosophy to continue to develop. All of this was put at risk at the Battle of Britain in World War II. Winston Churchill and the British people, with the support of others, muster the strength to stand against the Third Reich, preserving freedom for the world. In and of themselves, none of these events create the gift of freedom that we enjoy today. However, each of them proved to be critical historical tipping points in which the future of freedom in the world could have been altered or preserved, and yet here we are, free. Greek philosophy coupled with Judeo-Christian theology and morality allowed for freedom to develop in this age of freedom that we live in. And what I would like to say to you today is the freedom that we live in was not inevitable. It was not a foregone conclusion that we would live in a country which would be free. It is not inevitable on the earth that freedom will one day overtake all the earth. It is not inevitable. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to preserve. Democracy and freedom can be lost and has been many times in our world. A nation may be democratic for a period of time and then revert to despotism. Over the past 225 years, this has been shown time and time again. The experience of Germany between World War I and World War II. After World War I, they were a free people, right? And then Hitler, in that environment, rises up and they go back to despotism. And that is not only true of Germany, it was also true for Italy and Spain and other countries as well that we know from our modern history. Friends, here is something that is true that you might not recognize, and it is amazing to me. From 1783 to 1828, the United States of America stood entirely alone in the world as a free republic. From 1783 until 1828. My lifetime. My entire lifetime, in the history of the world, the United States of America stood alone as the only free republic on planet Earth. And then a wave of freedom came, and European nations began to join America as free nations, and they would go back and forth to fascist regimes, repressive regimes, socialist regimes. Socialism led to dictatorships, and eventually to communism. It happened through World War II until 1962. You see that same pattern of becoming free and leaving their freedom. Even some former friendly democracies are anti-American. And powerful countries like China and Russia and Venezuela, along with aggressively repressive regimes like North Korea and Iran, they are expanding their influence in the world. And considering this, is there any doubt that history is capable of repeating itself? I think not. It is entirely possible that our children or grandchildren could once again live under the abusive hands of a vicious tyrant. It is possible. Don't think that it is not possible. If this were to happen here in America, I could foresee a future for the earth in which the precious thing that we call liberty could become nothing but a memory. So how do we preserve our truly deeply flawed but unique and amazing republic? Vote. And tell the next generations that what they have is worth fighting for. Tell your kids and grandkids, when you get them together for barbecues at the 4th of July, pull your kids aside and tell them the stories of how precious freedom is. Your kids, don't leave it to others to educate your children and your grandchildren about the precious thing that we call freedom. You do it. You pull your grandkids aside and you tell them, I want you to know freedom is an amazing thing, and we're going to pass it down to you. But if Jesus tarries and you want to pass it to your grandkids, you better be willing to stand up for it. Don't give away your freedoms. Don't give away your freedoms. Tell your children and your grandchildren how important freedom is, how much it costs, how much it's worth fighting for. And for the children and the grandchildren all around the world that live under the dictatorships and despotisms and tyrants and abusers, don't become cold-hearted toward the world. It's hard to do. It's easy to become selfish when you have everything. We are rich in freedoms. Let's not commit the sin of you know what the sin of the wealthy is? Indifference. That we become indifferent to those who don't share our freedoms. Let's not become cold and indifferent to those who are suffering around the world. Amen. So, Elizabeth, if you'd come. We want to finish with a video, and then we're going to sing together. God bless America.